Hello and welcome to FTA's Circular 9050 Urbanized Areas Formula Grant Programs Training Series. I am Brett Martin with the Office of Grants Management and Guidance. FTA's Offices of Transit Programs and Grants Management and Guidance designed this series to provide our recipients and stakeholders a better understanding of changes made to FTA's official guidance for recipients' use of Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A formula funds apportioned to urbanized areas. To ensure we are all on the same page, I want to remind everyone that this presentation does not have the force and effect of the law and is not intended to bind the public in any way. It is educational and informational in nature, with an intent to explain some of our existing requirements under the law or agency policy. I would now like to introduce Bruce Robinson, our Associate Administrator of Program Management, to provide our welcoming remarks.
Hello, my name is Bruce Robinson, FTA's Associate Administrator for Program Management. On behalf of the team here at the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, I'm delighted to provide a brief introduction to the upcoming video training. FTA turned 60 years old this year, and one of our most exciting projects this year was updating several of FTA's major program circulars, as well as FTA's Award Management Requirement Circular, which is needed for all awards FTA administers. Over the last 2 years, staff worked tirelessly to update these circulars, working with headquarters and regional offices, as well as reaching out for public comment to update these documents. 4 circulars are Circular 5010, the Award Management Requirements Circular, Circular 9050, the Urbanized Area Formula Grant Program Guidance. This circular replaces, consolidates, and updates guidance for the Urbanized Area Formula Grant Program, the Data Good Repair Grant Program, and the Urbanized Area Formula component of the Grants of Buses and Bus Facilities Program. In addition, Circular 9040, the Rural Area Formula Grant Program Guidance, consolidates and updates guidance for the Buses and Bus Facilities Program, that is rural, and the Formula Grants for Rural Area Program. Finally, Circular 97 is the Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities Program Guidance. As part of the updated circular release, FTA developed a video series for each circular to relay key information and highlight changes. Additionally, the team developed a number of materials to help work with grantees and help set the stage for understanding federal financial assistance requirements surrounding administering federal fund awards. This circular and training series is specifically designed to assist FTA's efforts to improving customer service and streamlining our processes, as well as reflecting and incorporating provisions from the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or more commonly the FAST Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as changes to the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, more commonly referred to as 2 CFR 200 or the Uniform Guidance, as well as incorporating changes to FTA's policies and procedures. We hope you find these videos informative. FTA has created a general email address for questions related to this update, FTA Circular Update 2024 at dot.gov, to assist in addressing questions regarding this release. For questions about information in the circulars, please reach out to your FTA regional contacts. But for now, please enjoy the show. Thank you.
Each Friday from October 18 through November 15, 2024, FTA is posting a series of pre-recorded videos addressing summary grants management information and highlighting changes made in each of the updated circulars, including our Award Management Requirements Circular and each of our Formula Program circulars. The Circular 9050 Urbanized Areas Formula Grant Programs training builds upon the foundation we established in the previous training series for Circular 5010, our Award Management Requirements Circular. This series was developed to highlight many of the structural and substantive changes made to the circular to help users navigate and better understand the circular as a guidance tool. The illustration on the slide outlines the general topics for the sessions in this series. The route ahead is our agenda. For Session 3, we will walk through federal share for projects, intermodal eligibility of apportioned funds, eligible expenses, including changes in the structure of guidance on eligible expenses, changes to eligible capital projects, changes to capital project-related requirements, changes to eligible workforce development activities, and changes to our guidance on operating assistance. We will also cover the eligibility or ineligibility to use funds outside apportioned urbanized areas. Our speakers for this session are myself, from the Office of Grants Management and Guidance, and Kirsten Wired-Bauer and Ciara Williams from our Office of Transit Programs. And our first speaker for this session will be Ciara.
Thanks, Brett. I'm Ciara Williams with the Office of Transit Programs, and for the first part of this session, we're going to focus on federal and local share for projects, which is covered in Chapter 3 of Circular 9050. The permitted maximum federal share for a project depends on the type of expense it is, which can generally be broken down into expenses for planning projects, capital projects, and operating assistance. For planning projects which are eligible under 5307, the federal contribution may cover up to 80% of the net project cost. For capital projects, which are eligible under all three formula programs, it may also cover up to 80% of the net project cost, but it may be higher for certain projects that further compliance with the Americans with Disability Act or the Clean Air Act. The permitted maximum federal share for the acquisition of vehicles for the purposes of complying with or maintaining compliance with the ADA or CAA is 85%, and it is up to 90% for the acquisition of vehicle-related equipment or facilities, including clean fuel or alternative fuel vehicle-related equipment or facilities for the same purpose. In order to take advantage of this higher federal share for vehicle-related equipment, it may be necessary for equipment that qualifies to be itemized, so associated expenses that are eligible for the higher federal share may be isolated. For operating assistance, which is an eligible expense for many recipients under Section 5307, the maximum federal share is 50% of the net project cost, and this is where I want to stress that it is for 50% of a recipient's operating expenses that cannot be financed from other revenues that recipients collect in their operation of transit service. So this is the cost after deducting fare revenues, for example. It is also important to note that some expenses that are traditionally considered operating expenses under accounting principles are considered capital expenses by FTA, such as preventative maintenance. There were a few changes to the guidance on federal and local share made in Circular 9050. Two of them stem from changes made by the FAST Act to the permitted federal share for bicycle access projects. Since the enactment of the FAST Act, bicycle access projects are no longer eligible for a 90% federal share. Further, bicycle access projects that were implemented to satisfy the previously enacted minimum 1% expenditure on associated transit improvements in large urbanized areas are no longer eligible for a 95% federal share. However, these expenses are still eligible for up to an 80% federal share. An additional change that dovetails with what Brett covered in session 1 is that a lot of the more detailed guidance on sources of local federal share and how they may apply to projects and awards was moved to Circular 5010-1F because these issues are universal to all FTA programs. Okay. So now we'll move along and cover new guidance included in Circular 9050 and Chapter 4 that addresses the intermodal eligibility of apportioned funds. And we'll start with the intermodal eligibility of Section 5307 and 5340 funds. Section 5307 funds are partially apportioned based on service metrics for a variety of public transportation modes, such as bus and fixed guideway, including specific apportionments to some qualifying urbanized areas for commuter rail. This is particularly the case for large urbanized areas. Therefore, a certain share of an urbanized area's Section 5307 apportionment may be based on one mode, while another share may be based on a separate mode. The share of an urbanized area's apportionment that is based on service metrics for each mode may be expanded on eligible activities for any of the other modes. So an apportionment an urbanized area receives based on bus service metrics may be used to support fixed guideway and vice versa. We also added clarification to the circular that Section 5340 funds for growing and high density states that are added to urbanized areas, Section 5307 apportionment may also be expended on any mode as if they are Section 5307 funds. While this intermodal eligibility of apportioned funds applies to 5307 funds, there's more restriction on the intermodal eligibility of Section 5337 apportionments. In some urbanized areas, a share of their Section 5337 apportionment may be based on the high-intensity fixed guideway mode, while another share may be based on the high-intensity motor bus mode. Funds apportioned based on and for the fixed guideway mode may only be used for fixed guideway. Funds apportioned based on and for the high-intensity motor bus mode may be used for either high-intensity motor bus or fixed guideway. So while the apportionments for the high-intensity motor bus mode are interchangeable between the modes, the apportionments for the high-intensity fixed guideway are not. Additionally, even though 5337 funds are apportioned to urbanized areas for fixed guideway and high-intensity motor bus segments that have been in operation for at least 7 years, apportioned funds may be used for any part of a recipient system regardless of the duration a funded segment has been in revenue service. And that wraps up our coverage on federal share for projects and the intermodal eligibility of apportioned funds. Now I'll turn it back over to Brett.
Thanks, Ciara. Now I'm going to walk us through changes to the structure of our guidance on eligible expenses in Chapter 4 from the perspective of how to navigate the new structure. As we've mentioned, we combined our guidance on 3 separate formula programs into this single circular document. And these 3 programs have overlapping eligibility in terms of the types of projects and activities the funds from each may support. Section 5307 funds are eligible to support the broadest range of projects and activities, while Section 5337 and 5339A are eligible to support a narrower subset of what is generally eligible under 5307. Because of this, the structure of Chapter 4 is ordered to address eligible projects and activities under all 3 programs first, followed by what is eligible under only Section 5307. There is a table toward the beginning of Chapter 4 that summarizes categories of eligible activities and projects by formula grant program, and that provides links that will take circular users to those corresponding sections of Chapter 4. Okay, so let's focus a bit more on changes to the structure in Chapter 4 regarding how the circular communicates eligibility of capital projects under each of the 3 formula programs. Table 4.2, which is the Urban Formula Program's capital eligibility table, identifies the breadth of capital projects that are eligible under each of the 3 programs, in cases where there is overlap in project eligibility between 2 or more of them. Please note that this is a rather large table that extends over 4 pages. Table 4.3, which follows Table 4.2, identifies additional capital projects and activities that are not covered in Table 4.2 that are eligible under Section 5307 but are not eligible under Section 5337 or 5339A. The list of projects and activities in these tables are illustrative and not exhaustive, so there may be projects or activities that are eligible that go beyond what is listed. However, the list of projects and activities in the table is still rather comprehensive and should at least set the tone for the eligibility of projects or activities that are not specifically mentioned. I will show how both tables are organized on the following slides, but they both provide references to special provisions that may be applicable to the listed projects that are covered in later sections of Chapter 4 following the tables and in Chapter 5, such as, for example, capital cost of contracting or requirements specifically related to facilities projects. Another thing that changed, and that will look different from the pre-existing Circular 9030, is requirements related to vehicles, equipment, and facility eligibility were moved from the chapter addressing planning and project development to this chapter in Circular 9050 that addresses eligible projects and requirements. All right, so let's take a quick look at what Table 4.2 looks like, which is the Urban Formula Program's capital eligibility table that lays out illustrative projects that are eligible under 2 or more of the formula programs. In the far left columns, you will see a category of capital activities sorted first by mode or special category of capital expenses, and then by formula program, under which illustrative projects and activities listed in the 3rd column are eligible. As mentioned, the 4th column lists potential provisions or capital project related requirements that may be applicable to the illustrative expenses listed in the 3rd column, with page numbers for the applicable sections of the circular that address those provisions or requirements. And we'll take a quick look at Table 4.3, which identifies additional capital projects and activities that are not covered in Table 4.2 that are eligible under Section 5307 but are not generally eligible under Section 5337 or 5339A. The far left column of this table lists a specific category of project or activity eligible under Section 5307 with a list of illustrative expenses provided in the middle column and additional provisions or capital project related requirements that may be applicable to those illustrative expenses provided in the third column, with page numbers for the applicable sections of the circular that address those provisions or requirements. All right, so now that we have set the table for how Chapter 4 in Circular 9050 is structured, let's talk about more specific changes in eligible capital projects addressed in those tables I just covered. And we will start with an overview of these changes, and I will go into more detail in the following slides on a couple of them. The first change that you may notice is the guidance on capital project eligibility now puts a lot more emphasis on the eligibility of technological changes or innovations to modify low or no emission vehicles or related facilities. This dovetails with the increasing emphasis FTA has put on the transition of public transportation fleets toward cleaner fuel technologies since the Urbanized Area Formula Program's circulars were last updated 9 to 10 years ago. Another change that came about with the FAST Act is the eligibility for recipients to use up to 20% of their Section 5307 apportionment at the capital project federal share rate of 80% to support complementary paratransit services if the service meets certain requirements detailed in Title 49, Section 5302 of the United States Code. And yet another change that was made regarding capital project eligibility is we provided further clarification on the eligibility of bicycle-related projects, as well as for other similar individualized mobility devices, such as scooters or segways. Okay, so we'll dive a bit deeper now into the ability for recipients to use a portion of the annual Section 5307 apportionment for complementary paratransit services at the capital project federal share rate of 80%. Recipients may use up to 10% of the apportionment for this purpose if the recipient is in compliance with DOT regulations at 49 CFR Parts 27, 37, and 38 in its implementation of the transportation provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. They may use up to 20% if the recipient using this allowance has at least two of an active fixed route travel training program that is available for riders with disabilities, all fixed route and paratransit operators participating in a passenger safety, disability awareness, and sensitivity training class on at least a biennial basis, or memoranda of understanding in place with employers and the American Job Center to increase access to employment opportunities for people with disabilities. These 10% or 20% allowances apply at the total urbanized area apportionment level. So in urbanized areas with more than one recipient, it is possible for a recipient to use more than 20% of its share of the annual Section 5307 funds apportioned to that urbanized area for this purpose. Designated recipients and states are responsible for allocating these allowances in cases where there are multiple recipients in an urbanized area. Okay, now we will dive a bit deeper into our clarification on the eligibility of bicycle-related expenses. Because bicycle transportation is an individualized mode of travel, it does not qualify under FTA's definition of public transportation. That said, however, many bicycle-related expenses qualify as associated transit improvements and are eligible under Section 5307. Such expenses include bicycle access improvements that are physically and functionally related to transit, bicycle storage, shelters and parking facilities, and installation of equipment for transporting bikes on public transit vehicles, and infrastructure expenses to accommodate the presence of bicycle or other mobility device sharing programs in the vicinity of transit stops or stations. However, expenses for the acquisition or maintenance of bicycles, scooters, segways, or other similar individualized mobility devices are not eligible expenses of FTA funds. Okay, now I will turn it over to Kirsten to talk about capital project related requirements.
All right, thank you, Brett. I am Kirsten Wired-Bauer with the Office of Transit Programs, and I am going to cover changes to our guidance on capital project related requirements reflected in Circular 9050. And I will start with a change regarding the leasing of capital assets. Our uniform guidance for federal awards previously required recipients to ensure that leasing of a capital asset was more cost-effective than purchasing or constructing the same capital asset. It also required recipients to conduct a cost comparison to determine this cost-effectiveness. These steps are no longer required. Another minor change to our guidance concerns recipients' proposals for the size of facility projects. The updated guidance acknowledges that proposed facilities may need space for a transition to cleaner fuel vehicles and the infrastructure necessary to maintain and accommodate those vehicles. It also recognizes that new large facilities or expanded facilities may warrant significant or even dramatic increases in space if the recipient can demonstrate the need for this additional space through a credible, financially constrained planning process, such as the metropolitan planning process. Additionally, guidance was expanded to address the eligibility of joint development under all three of the Urbanized Area Formula programs. And moving along to some other changes, Circular 9050 clarifies that projects funded under any of the three Urbanized Area Formula programs may be subject to FTA's project management oversight requirements if the project meets the criteria described in 49 CFR Part 633. While it is already widely understood that this more involved project management oversight applies to capital investment grant or CIG projects that meet their criteria, it actually applies regardless of the funding source. Circular 9050 also includes updated guidance on the design and installation of public art and non-functional landscaping. The design or installation of standalone art or the incremental costs of incorporating art or non-functional landscaping are not eligible expenses of FTA Urbanized Area Formula funds. The incidental costs of including an artist on a design team are also not eligible. However, art that serves a functional or aesthetic design purpose may be integrated into a facility's design, landscaping, and historic preservation activities, and are eligible as a capital expense as part of those activities. Circular 9050 also includes new guidance on innovative procurement tools, which were incorporated and authorized by Section 3019 of the FAST Act. To the extent practicable, recipients of Section 5339A funds should use these tools. The intent of these tools is to allow for the pooling of purchases and reduced customization to achieve economies of scale and therefore a reduced cost per unit of equipment and rolling stock. If a recipient of Section 5339A funds proposes to purchase fewer than 5 buses through a standalone procurement, then the recipient must provide a written explanation as to why it did not use the tools authorized under Section 3019 of the FAST Act. These tools have an emphasis on joint procurement and include cooperative procurement contracts, state cooperative procurement schedules, and a joint procurement clearinghouse. All right, so we'll move along to another topic with updated guidance, the accommodation of private intercity or charter transportation access at FTA-funded facilities. Services provided by private intercity or charter transportation operators are not considered public transportation and are therefore not eligible under the Urbanized Area Formula programs covered by Circular 9050. However, a recipient of FTA financial assistance may not deny a private intercity or charter transportation operator the reasonable access to federally funded public transportation facilities. This includes intermodal facilities, park and ride lots, and bus-only highway lanes. In determining what actually constitutes reasonable access, recipients may consider capacity requirements and the extent to which providing access would be detrimental to existing public transportation services. This may include a review of physical constraints, scheduling and resource availability, and safety and security measures. Okay, so move along now to changes to our guidance in Circular 9050 regarding capital cost of contracting. To better contextualize the changes, we will set the stage here with a review of what capital cost of contracting is and how it applies to recipients. We When recipients contract with private entities to procure capital that will be consumed to provide public transportation services, FTA will participate at the 80% federal share rate in the cost of the capital consumed over the course of the contract. In order to do this, the assets used by the contractor must be privately owned for FTA to participate in the capital consumed. Assets purchased with government assistance are ineligible. Recipients may use Section 5307, 5337, and/or 5339A funds to support the capital consumed for bus and paratransit services as eligible and applicable. The intent of the capital cost of contracting tool is to allow recipients to avoid burdensome accounting rules that would otherwise require them to disaggregate capital costs that are eligible at the 80% federal share versus those eligible at a 50% federal share for operating assistance within a contract. It is also important to note that this is a choice. Recipients may indeed disaggregate and isolate these costs within a contract and receive reimbursement based on how they fall with respect to those different federal shares. However, if they choose not to do this, they may use the assumed percentages in Table 4.4 as the share of the contract costs that are eligible at the capital federal share rate, which is 80%. And this here is a snapshot of what Table 4.4 looks like within the circular. This table and much of the guidance explaining the table were updated from the formula program's previous circulars to combine how capital cost of contracting would apply to each. It lays out various scenarios for what may be included under a contract, such as whether the contractor provides vehicles, maintenance, and/or transit service. It also lays out the percentage of the dollar amount of a contract that may be considered capital and therefore eligible at the capital federal share rate for each of the 3 urbanized area formula programs covered by the circular. I will talk more about this in the next slide. The percentages are the same for Section 5307 and 5337 funds, but keep in mind that this is for bus and paratransit related contract services, so it would be isolated to those expenses under each. For Section 5339A, the percentages are different because preventive maintenance is not an eligible expense under that program. Okay, so here are some further points regarding changes to this guidance. So as mentioned, we added guidance on how this would apply to Section 5337 funds. Only buses used for bus rapid transit services or on high occupancy vehicle lanes are eligible for capital cost of contracting with these funds. Also, as mentioned, preventive maintenance is not an eligible expense of Section 5339A funds, so the use of these funds is limited to amounts that are attributable to leasing and depreciation of the vehicles, equipment, and facilities provided by the contractor. And again, we would like to stress that recipients have the choice to justify higher shares of a contract that are eligible at the 80% capital federal share rate, but must disaggregate those expenses in the contract. Okay, so we will now move along to changes in our guidance in Circular 9050 regarding eligible workforce development activities. Our guidance in the circular was updated to reflect FAST-Act changes to provisions in 49 U.S.C. Section 5314 and the repeal of 49 U.S.C. Section 5322. Up to 0.5% of recipients Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A funds each fiscal year may be expended on programs that address human resource development and training needs at an 80% federal share. This may support employment training programs, outreach to increase employment for underrepresented groups, research on public transportation personnel and training needs, and other similar activities. Supportive or wraparound services may also be eligible as part of this and could include such expenses as child care for trainees, work clothing, travel to training sites, and others. Further, up to an additional 0.5% of recipients Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A funds may be expended each fiscal year for direct educational expenses at the National Transit Institute. This may include other existing local education and training programs supported by the Departments of Transportation, Labor, or Education for education and training of state and local transportation employees. These activities are eligible at an 80% federal share. I'll also note that for the programs where preventive maintenance is an otherwise eligible expense, so that's 5307 and 5337, that additional training for maintenance personnel may be conducted beyond that 0.5% cap of recipients' apportionments at a maximum 80% federal share. For the program where operating expenses are otherwise eligible, so that's the Section 5307 program, additional training for operations personnel may also be conducted beyond that 0.5% cap at a maximum of 50% federal share. All right, so that wraps up my coverage on changes to capital project related requirements and to our other guidance on workforce development activities. And I am now going to turn it back over to Brett to cover our remaining topics in this session.
Thanks, Kirsten. We will now venture into changes to our guidance on operating assistance under Section 5307, reflected in our new Circular 9050. We will go into more detail on the last point listed here in subsequent slides, but to provide an overview of the changes to our guidance on operating assistance, we clarified that recipients in large urbanized areas may expend funds on public transportation security operating projects or activities, and not just capital projects if they are otherwise eligible to expend funds on operating assistance. We also added routine maintenance, technical support, and user fees for technology and software used in the operation of public transportation as eligible operating expenses. And further, we updated our guidance to account for multiple modifications in our governing statutes that address our special operations rule for large urbanized areas that have occurred since MAP 21. And now we will focus a bit more closely on the last point I just made and talk more about our operating assistance limitations in large urbanized areas. To start, it is worth mentioning that there is no limit on the amount of a Section 5307 apportionment that can be used for operating assistance in small urbanized areas. However, in large urbanized areas, the amount of an apportionment that may be used depends on the number of fixed route or demand response vehicles a recipient operates in peak service, excluding those used for Americans with Disabilities Act complimentary paratransit service. Recipients that operate more than 100 buses in peak service may not use any of their Section 5307 apportionment on operating assistance. Those that operate between 76 and 100 buses in peak service may use up to 50% of their apportionment on operating assistance. And those that operate 75 or fewer buses in peak service may use up to 75% of their apportionment on operating assistance. However, this does not mean that 50% or 70% of whatever the recipient receives from the apportionment may be used for that purpose. What recipients that may use some of their apportionment are restricted to is based on the percentage of the apportionment that is attributable to them as measured by vehicle revenue hours within the urbanized area. So for example, if Transit Agency X operates 50% of the vehicle revenue hours in an urbanized area with 85 buses in peak service, that recipient is restricted to using 25% of the total apportionment to the urbanized area for operating assistance because the recipient provides half the service in the urbanized area and is restricted to half of that based on the number of buses it operates. Operating assistance caps for operators in large urbanized areas based on these parameters are established with each Section 5307 fiscal year apportionment in Apportionment Table 3A. For recipients that operate both fixed route and demand response buses in peak service, the percentage of the apportionment that may be used is based on the number of fixed route buses only. Another important point on this is Section 5307 funds apportioned to large urbanized areas may not be used for rail fixed guideway operations. However, there is an exception to this method of determining the operating assistance cap for operators in large urbanized areas. If there is more than one operator in a single large urbanized area, an operator may expend up to 10% more than the operating assistance cap as determined by the operator's share of vehicle revenue hours in the urbanized area if the share attributable to the system is included in the designated recipient's final program of projects for the apportionment as determined through the local planning process, and the higher share provided to that operator does not exceed the applicable percentage available to the system for operating assistance based on the number of vehicles it operates in peak hours. So these operators can be given up to 10% more for operating assistance than the percentage of vehicle revenue hours they represent in the urbanized area. But if an operator is restricted to 50% based on the number of buses it operates, for example, it cannot use more than 50% of the amount it ultimately receives of the apportionment on operating assistance. The amounts that reflect this exception are also provided in Apportionment Table 3A. Okay, our last topic in this session concerns the eligibility or ineligibility to use funds apportioned to an urbanized area outside of that urbanized area. There are many transit service areas throughout the U.S. that encompass a mix of urbanized area and rural environments. There are also many that engage more than one urbanized area. A new section was included in Circular 9050 that addresses whether and to what extent funds apportioned to an urbanized area may be used for projects or activities that are partially or wholly outside of the apportioned urbanized area. Also, how such flexibilities would apply to the use of urbanized area funds for both operating assistance and capital projects, including for both mobile and fixed location capital assets and activities. And how such flexibilities would apply to the use of both urbanized area and rural funds in a dual funding scenario for operating assistance and capital projects. All right, so let's start with how this flexibility or inflexibility applies to operating assistance, which is only an eligible expense under Section 5307. Recipients may use Section 5307 funds apportioned or transferred to an urbanized area outside that urbanized area, so in a rural area or in another urbanized area, if they support a geographically continuous service with at least one route stop or passenger access point in the apportioned urbanized area. So with our picture on the slide, Route A is eligible because it does this. However, Route B is ineligible because it does not have a stop or passenger access point in the apportioned urbanized area. For capital projects or activities, we break down the eligibility to use funds outside an apportioned urbanized area by whether they are supporting mobile capital assets or immobile fixed location capital assets. For mobile capital assets, such as rolling stock or associated maintenance, recipients may use Section 5307, 5337, or 5339A funds apportioned or transferred to an urbanized area outside the urbanized area if they support a geographically continuous service with at least one route stop or passenger access point in the urbanized area. This is really the same as the extent of flexibility recipients have for using funds apportioned or transferred to an urbanized area for operating assistance. So again, Route A is eligible while Route B is not. For capital projects or activities involving fixed location assets, such as rail stations, bus stops, fixed guideway, and other infrastructure, the extent to which funds apportioned or transferred to an urbanized area may be used for these types of assets depends on whether the asset is physically located within or supports transit service provided within the respective urbanized area. Section 5307, 5337, or 5339A funds may be used on such projects or activities without restriction on the proportion those funds may represent toward the total cost of the asset, if that asset is or will be physically located within the apportioned urbanized area. If the asset will not be physically located within the apportioned urbanized area, funds may be used in proportion to the extent the asset supports transit service provided in the apportioned urbanized area based on a reasonable cost allocation methodology. Okay, let's work through an example to illustrate how this might work for a fixed location capital asset. A recipient proposes to use a combination of Section 5307 and 5339A funds apportioned to Lovely Urbanized Area to construct a $1 million bus maintenance facility. And the facility is eligible for a federal share of up to 80%. The facility will be located just outside the boundary of lovely urbanized area, but will accommodate vehicles and operations for services provided in both lovely urbanized area and surrounding rural area. A reasonable cost allocation methodology reveals that 70% of the capacity of the facility will be used for urbanized area services, and 30% will be used for rural services. This determination can be driven by a number of methods, such as maybe the split of vehicle revenue hours or miles between urbanized area and rural services, or other similar methods. Given the results of the cost allocation exercise, 70% of the $100 million total cost of the facility may be supported by funds apportioned to the lovely urbanized area at up to an 80% federal participation rate, or up to $56 million. The remaining $24 million eligible for federal financial participation may come from other eligible non-FTA funding sources, FTA funds apportioned for use in the rural area, such as Section 5311 funds, or a combination thereof. However, with this being the general rule, there is an exception to the requirement for a reasonable cost allocation methodology for certain fixed guideway segments. If a recipient attributes fixed guideway miles for service that is provided outside of the urbanized area to the urbanized area as described in 49 U.S.C. 5336 B2E, the recipient receives credit for no less than 27% of the fixed guideway vehicle revenue miles and directional route miles that are located outside the urbanized area for which the recipient receives Section 5307 and 5337 apportionments. Because urbanized areas receive credit for the miles associated with these segments in their apportionments, recipients that report those miles may use Section 5307 and or 5337 funds to support fixed location capital assets outside the urbanized area that contribute to or are otherwise associated with such a fixed guideway segment at up to 100% of the total cost of the asset at the eligible federal share ratio. All right, and the last point I'd like to make on this overall topic concerns services supported by both urbanized area funds and rural funds. So, for example, maybe a single service supported by both Section 5307 and 5311 funds. Under this scenario, recipients may use either urbanized area or rural funds entirely, or a combination of urbanized area funds and rural funds, for a geographically continuous service with a route stop or passenger access point in both the apportioned urbanized area and rural area, or for mobile capital assets that support such a service. If only rural funds will be used, the service must be designed primarily to bring rural passengers to and from the urbanized area with a limited number of stops within the urbanized area. This concludes our formal presentation of the 3 sessions for our Circular 9050.1a training series. While this slide is entitled Next Steps, the ball is really in your court to decide what you would like to do next. As noted, we are continuing our series of videos that will be posted to FTA's website through mid-November 2024. Those videos are posted where you found this one. The email address goes right to our office, and we will follow up to address those questions and concerns. Also included are links to the finalized circulars. As part of our ongoing efforts and commitment to serving the public, FTA is committed to improving America's communities through improving public transportation. We share a vision of fostering a better quality of life for all, built on public transportation excellence through commitment to service, integrity, innovation, sustainability, and equity. Thank you again for watching, and we hope you will view our other videos related to the updated circulars.